Number 1. The North Hollywood Shootout, when bank robbers turned a neighborhood into a war zone on the morning of February 28, 1997. The residents of North Hollywood, Los Angeles, were going about their ordinary Friday routines when their quiet neighborhood transformed into what witnesses would later describe as a scene from an action movie. Except the bullets were real, the blood was real, and the terror was absolute. Larry Eugene Phillips Jr. and Emil Matasareanu, two heavily armed bank robbers wearing full body armor and wielding automatic weapons, entered a Bank of America branch at 6600 Laurel Canyon Boulevard at approximately 9:17 a.m., and what followed would become one of the most infamous shootouts in American law enforcement history, broadcast live on television as news helicopters captured every terrifying moment. The two men had meticulously planned their robbery, spending months preparing, acquiring illegally modified fully automatic rifles including AKM and AR-15 variants, and outfitting themselves with homemade body armor that covered their entire torsos and legs, making them nearly impervious to the standard 9mm and .38 caliber handguns carried by Los Angeles Police Department patrol officers. When they entered the bank that morning, employees and customers immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong as the men, wearing ski masks and carrying duffel bags, began shouting commands and firing weapons into the ceiling to establish dominance and create fear. The robbery itself lasted only a few minutes as the duo forced bank employees to fill their bags with cash, ultimately taking approximately $303,305. But their escape plan would completely unravel in the most violent way imaginable. As Phillips and Matasareanu exited the bank at 9:24 a.m., they were immediately confronted by LAPD officers who had responded to the silent alarm, and rather than surrender, the robbers opened fire with their automatic weapons, unleashing a hail of armor-piercing bullets that tore through patrol cars, storefront windows, and anything else in their path. The responding officers, armed only with their standard-issue pistols and shotguns, found themselves completely outgunned as their bullets bounced harmlessly off the robbers' body armor, while the criminals' high-powered rounds penetrated the police vehicles that officers were using for cover. For 44 minutes, the streets of North Hollywood became a battlefield as Phillips and Matasareanu walked through the neighborhood, calmly firing hundreds of rounds at police officers, news helicopters, and anyone who moved, while officers desperately called for backup and citizens trapped in nearby businesses huddled in terror, praying the walls would stop the bullets screaming past outside. Television news crews, drawn by the police radio traffic, arrived and began broadcasting the shootout live, giving millions of viewers across the nation a real-time window into urban warfare as they watched two men in body armor methodically attempt to murder police officers in broad daylight while seemingly immune to return fire. The sound of gunfire was so intense and sustained that witnesses blocks away reported thinking a war had broken out, and the visual evidence captured on camera showed the astonishing violence as sparks flew from ricocheting bullets, car windows exploded, and the pavement was torn apart by the relentless gunfire. LAPD officers, recognizing they were facing an unprecedented threat, made the extraordinary decision to commandeer weapons from a nearby gun store, taking AR-15 rifles that could match the firepower of the robbers, though this adaptation came too late to change the early dynamics of the battle. Phillips and Matasareanu, realizing they couldn't escape in their original getaway vehicle which had been disabled by police gunfire, attempted to carjack several vehicles while continuing to fire at officers, and during this phase of the shootout, Matasareanu successfully commandeered a white sedan while Phillips provided covering fire, spraying the surrounding area with automatic weapons fire that sent officers diving for cover. The turning point came when LAPD SWAT team members, who had been deployed from various locations across Los Angeles, finally arrived with their own high-powered weapons and tactical training, allowing them to engage the suspects more effectively than the overwhelmed patrol officers had been able to do. Matasareanu, driving the hijacked vehicle, became separated from Phillips and was eventually cornered by police near the intersection of Archwood and Remmet Streets, where officers concentrated their fire on him, ultimately shooting out the car's tires and forcing him to stop. As Matasareanu exited the disabled vehicle, he was struck by multiple police rounds, with several bullets finally finding gaps in his body armor, including shots that hit his unprotected legs, severing a femoral artery and causing him to collapse onto the pavement where he continued to fire his weapon at officers until blood loss finally incapacitated him. Despite being critically wounded, Matasareanu was not immediately given medical attention as police protocol required the scene to be secured before paramedics could approach, and the delay, combined with the severity of his wounds, resulted in him bleeding to death on the street approximately 1 hour after being shot, a fact that would later generate significant controversy and multiple lawsuits against the LAPD. Meanwhile, Phillips, now alone and still engaged in a running gun battle with police, attempted to flee on foot while firing his rifle and a Beretta 92 FS pistol at pursuing officers, and during this desperate escape attempt, he sustained multiple gunshot wounds, including one to his hand that disabled his rifle, forcing him to rely solely on his pistol. Realizing he was surrounded, bleeding, and running out of ammunition, Phillips made the decision to end his own life, placing his pistol under his chin and firing a final shot that killed him instantly on the sidewalk of Archwood Street, bringing his portion of the rampage to a definitive end at approximately 10:01 a.m. When the smoke finally cleared and investigators began processing what had become a massive crime scene spanning several city blocks, they discovered that during the 44-minute shootout, the two suspects had fired approximately 1,100 rounds of ammunition, while LAPD officers had fired approximately 650 rounds in response, creating a combined total of over 1,700 bullets discharged in a residential neighborhood in the middle of a weekday morning. Miraculously, despite the extraordinary volume of gunfire and the dozens of civilians who had been in the area when the shooting began, only 2 people died that day, both of them the suspects, though 20 people were injured, including 12 police officers and 8 civilians who had been struck by bullets or injured by flying debris and shrapnel. The aftermath of the North Hollywood Shootout led to sweeping changes in American law enforcement, as police departments across the country recognized that the threat of heavily armed criminals with military-grade weapons and body armor required a fundamental shift in how patrol officers were equipped and trained. The LAPD, along with numerous other agencies, began issuing patrol rifles to frontline officers, upgraded their body armor, improved their tactical training for active shooter scenarios, and developed new protocols for dealing with suspects who outgunned standard police equipment. The shootout also renewed debates about the availability of high-powered weapons to civilians, the effectiveness of body armor regulations, and the militarization of American police forces, with advocates on all sides using the North Hollywood incident to support their positions on gun control, police equipment, and public safety policy. For the officers who had been pinned down by sustained automatic weapons fire while armed only with pistols, many of whom had emptied their weapons multiple times while watching their bullets bounce off the suspect's armor, the psychological trauma was profound and lasting, with several officers requiring extended therapy to process the experience of feeling completely helpless while being systematically hunted by men who seemed invincible. The physical evidence recovered from the scene painted a picture of meticulous preparation by Phillips and Madasarianu, who investigators discovered had been planning bank robberies for years, accumulating an arsenal that included multiple illegally modified automatic weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition, custom-made body armor constructed from trauma plates and Kevlar, and detailed surveillance notes on multiple banks throughout the Los Angeles area. Background investigations revealed that Phillips, who had been born on September 20, 1970, in Glendale, California, had a history of criminal activity including previous arrests and convictions, and had become increasingly radicalized in his anti-government views, believing that banks were legitimate targets because they were insured and therefore victimless to rob. Madasarianu, born on July 19, 1966, in Romania, had immigrated to the United States with his family and had initially pursued legitimate work before connecting with Phillips and descending into a criminal partnership that would ultimately cost both men their lives. The investigation also uncovered evidence that the pair had conducted at least 3 other bank robberies in the preceding months, using similar tactics though without the catastrophic confrontation that occurred in North Hollywood, and had been living relatively comfortable lives on the proceeds of their crimes while planning ever more ambitious robberies. The legal aftermath focused primarily on civil lawsuits, as both suspects were dead and therefore beyond criminal prosecution, with families of injured parties suing the city of Los Angeles over various aspects of the incident, including the delayed medical treatment for Madasarianu, the danger created by police crossfire, and the psychological trauma suffered by civilians who witnessed the violence. Most of these lawsuits were eventually settled or dismissed, though they contributed to ongoing discussions about police tactics, use of force, and the balance between aggressive law enforcement response and public safety during active shooting incidents. The North Hollywood Shootout has been analyzed extensively by law enforcement agencies, military tacticians, criminologists, and firearms experts, with numerous documentaries, books, and training materials using the incident as a case study in criminal audacity, law enforcement adaptation, and the chaotic reality of armed confrontation in urban environments. Video footage from the incident, captured by news helicopters and surveillance cameras, has been viewed millions of times and remains a stark reminder of how quickly a routine Friday morning can dissolve into violence and chaos when determined criminals decide that surrender is not an option and are willing to create a war zone in a residential neighborhood with no regard for innocent lives. The event fundamentally changed not just the LAPD but law enforcement across America, serving as the watershed moment that convinced police administrators that the old model of lightly armed patrol officers responding to all incidents was no longer adequate in an era where criminals could access military-grade firepower. Today, the intersection where much of the shootout occurred looks like any other Los Angeles neighborhood, with businesses operating, traffic flowing, and residents going about their daily lives. But for those who were there on February 28, 1997, who heard the bullets, saw the sparks, smelled the gunpowder, and felt the terror of being caught in a battle they never imagined would happen in broad daylight in their own neighborhood, the memories remain vivid and the understanding that the thin veneer of civilized society can be shattered in an instant by two men with guns, and the willingness to use them without mercy or hesitation continues to shape their view of safety, security, and the unpredictability of violence in modern America. Number 2. The assassination of Gianni Versace, a fashion icon murdered on his doorstep the morning of July 15, 1997, began as many others had for Gianni Versace, the legendary Italian fashion designer whose name had become synonymous with luxury, glamour, and innovative style that transformed the fashion industry and made him one of the most recognized and influential creative figures in the world. Versace, who was 50 years old and at the absolute pinnacle of his creative powers and commercial success, had been staying at his opulent mansion Casa Casuarina on Ocean Drive in Miami Beach, Florida, a property he had purchased in 1992 and meticulously renovated into a stunning showcase of art, architecture, and refined taste that reflected his aesthetic vision. That morning, following his usual routine, Versace walked from his mansion to a nearby news cafe, a local establishment he frequented, to purchase magazines including Italian publications that kept him connected to his homeland and the European fashion scene. The walk was short, only about 2 blocks, and Versace made the trip casually dressed in shorts and a t-shirt, a stark contrast to the elaborate haute couture he was famous for creating, and he completed his errand without incident, collecting his magazines and beginning the return walk to his mansion at approximately 8:30 a.m. As Versace approached the gates of Casa Casuarina, walking up the short set of steps leading to his property while carrying his magazines, he was entirely unaware that he had been targeted by Andrew Cunanan, a 27-year-old serial killer who had been on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list and who had already murdered 4 other men during a cross-country killing spree that had begun 3 months earlier in Minneapolis. Cunanan, who had been hiding in Miami Beach for 2 months while living in a houseboat and surviving on petty theft and the charity of acquaintances, had apparently fixated on Versace as his next victim, though the exact nature of their prior relationship, if any existed, remains disputed and unclear even decades later. As Versace reached his gate and began to unlock it, Cunanan approached from behind, raised a .40 caliber Taurus PT-100 semi-automatic pistol that he had stolen from one of his previous victims, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range directly into Versace's head, with the bullets striking the designer on the left side of his face and the back of his skull, killing him almost instantly. Versace collapsed on the steps of his own mansion, his blood pooling on the concrete while his magazines scattered around him, and Cunanan calmly fled the scene on foot, walking quickly but not running, his audacity in committing murder in broad daylight on a busy street in a popular tourist area demonstrating either extraordinary confidence or complete disregard for consequences. Witnesses who had been on Ocean Drive that morning, including tourists, local residents, and workers at nearby hotels and businesses, heard the gunshots and saw Cunanan leaving the scene, with several people immediately calling 911 while others rushed to Versace's side, though there was nothing they could do as the designer had been mortally wounded and died within moments of being shot. Miami Beach police arrived within minutes and immediately secured the crime scene while paramedics confirmed what was already evident to everyone present, that Gianni Versace, one of the world's most famous fashion designers, had been murdered on his doorstep in a brazen daytime execution that would send shockwaves through the fashion industry and capture international media attention. The investigation moved with extraordinary speed as FBI agents, already hunting Cunanan for his previous murders, converged on Miami Beach and began coordinating with local law enforcement to track down the killer who had now claimed his fifth victim and who they believed was still in the Miami area. Witnesses provided descriptions of Cunanan. Security camera footage from nearby businesses captured images of a man matching his description in the vicinity at the time of the shooting, and the .40 caliber shell casings recovered from the scene were ballistically matched to the weapon Cunanan had stolen from William Reese, a cemetery caretaker in New Jersey, whom Cunanan had murdered in May during his flight from Minnesota. The manhunt intensified to an unprecedented level as the FBI, understanding that Cunanan had demonstrated a pattern of staying in areas after committing murders, and that he had been living in Miami Beach for weeks, flooded the area with agents and deployed extensive resources including helicopters, tracking dogs, and surveillance teams to locations where Cunanan might appear. Tips poured in from around the country as Cunanan's photograph, plastered across every news outlet and featured on America's Most Wanted, generated thousands of reported sightings, though most proved to be false alarms or cases of mistaken identity. The breakthrough came on July 23, 8 days after Versace's murder, when a caretaker for a houseboat on Indian Creek, a waterway in Miami Beach, noticed that the vessel appeared to have been broken into and that someone might be inside. Police surrounded the houseboat and attempted to make contact with anyone inside. But when there was no response and officers heard a single gunshot from within the vessel, they exercised extreme caution, establishing a perimeter and calling in specialized tactical units before making entry. After several hours of tense standoff, during which there was no movement or sound from inside the houseboat, SWAT team members finally entered the vessel and discovered Andrew Cunanan's body on a bed in the second-floor bedroom, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, fired from the same .40 caliber Taurus pistol he had used to kill Versace and Reese. Cunanan had taken his own life rather than face capture, ending his killing spree but also eliminating any possibility of understanding his motivations, his thought processes, or the specific reasons he had targeted each of his 5 victims, including Gianni Versace. The investigation into Cunanan's background revealed a complex and deeply troubled individual who had been living a double life, presenting himself to some acquaintances as a wealthy, worldly sophisticate while actually surviving through a combination of deception, theft, and dependency on older wealthy men who supported him financially in exchange for companionship. Cunanan had been born on August 31, 1969, in National City, California, and had shown early signs of high intelligence, attending an elite private school where he was described as charming and articulate, but also manipulative and prone to creating elaborate lies about his background and accomplishments. As he grew older, Cunanan became increasingly involved in the gay social scene in San Diego and later San Francisco, where he developed relationships with wealthy older men and maintained a lifestyle that appeared glamorous but was built on deception and financial dependency that would eventually crumble. The series of murders that culminated in Versace's death had begun on April 27, 1997, when Cunanan killed Jeffrey Trail, a 28-year-old former naval officer, in Minneapolis, beating him to death with a claw hammer in an apartment belonging to another of Cunanan's acquaintances, David Madsen. Days later, on May 3rd, Cunanan shot and killed David Madsen himself, whose body was found near a lake outside Minneapolis, and investigators later theorized that Madsen may have witnessed Trail's murder and was killed to eliminate him as a witness, though Cunanan's exact motivations remain speculative. Cunanan then fled Minnesota and traveled to Chicago, where on May 4th he murdered 72-year-old Lee Miglin, a wealthy real estate developer, in an exceptionally brutal killing that involved torture and mutilation, and stole Miglin's Lexus automobile, which Cunanan then drove east. The 4th victim was William Reese, the New Jersey cemetery caretaker, whom Cunanan shot on May 9th apparently for the sole purpose of stealing his pickup truck after Cunanan determined that the Lexus he had taken from Miglin was too recognizable and might lead to his capture. Driving Reese's truck, Cunanan then made his way to Miami Beach, where he arrived in mid-May and somehow managed to evade detection for 2 months despite being on the FBI's most wanted list and despite pawning stolen items and interacting with various people in the Miami Beach area. The question of whether Cunanan and Versace had a prior relationship has been the subject of extensive speculation and investigation, with some sources claiming they had met at social events in San Francisco years earlier and others insisting they had no connection whatsoever, but no definitive evidence has ever emerged to prove conclusively that they knew each other beyond possibly crossing paths casually in social settings that both men frequented. What remains clear is that Cunanan chose to target Versace despite the enormous risk involved in killing such a high-profile individual in broad daylight in a location where escape would be difficult, suggesting either that personal animosity motivated the murder or that Cunanan, perhaps sensing that capture was inevitable, decided to commit a final act that would ensure his infamy. The impact of Versace's murder reverberated far beyond the immediate shock and grief felt by his family, friends, and colleagues, extending into broader discussions about celebrity security, the vulnerability of public figures to determined attackers, and the challenges law enforcement faces when hunting fugitives who are willing to move frequently and commit violence without apparent pattern or rational motive. Donatella Versace, Gianni's sister and creative partner who would go on to lead the Versace fashion house after his death, was devastated by the loss, describing her brother as not just a business partner but her best friend and creative inspiration. And the fashion industry collectively mourned a visionary whose influence on style, celebrity culture, and the business of luxury fashion could not be overstated. The Versace mansion on Ocean Drive, where the murder occurred, eventually changed hands several times and was converted into a luxury hotel called the Villa Casa Casuarina, with the front steps where Versace died becoming a pilgrimage site for fans who leave flowers and tributes to commemorate the designer's life and mourn the senseless violence that ended it. The investigation into why law enforcement had not captured Cunanan before he reached Versace led to criticism of the FBI's handling of the manhunt, with some observers arguing that greater urgency and better coordination between agencies might have prevented the fashion designer's death, though FBI officials defended their efforts and noted that Cunanan had proven exceptionally skilled at evading detection while moving across the country. The broader cultural impact of Versace's murder in broad daylight on a public street in a major American city underscored the reality that fame and wealth provide no guaranteed protection against violence, and that determined killers can strike at even the most prominent figures if they are willing to sacrifice their own freedom or life in the process. Andrew Cunanan's suicide meant that many questions about his motivations, his relationship with his victims, and his mental state during the 3-month killing spree would never be definitively answered, leaving investigators, journalists, and the public to piece together a psychological portrait from the fragments of his life, the pattern of his crimes, and the testimonies of those who knew him. The case has been examined in numerous books, documentaries, and dramatizations, including the acclaimed television series The Assassination of Gianni Versace, American Crime Story, which explored both Versace's life and Cunanan's descent into serial murder while raising questions about homophobia, celebrity worship, mental illness, and the American dream's dark underside. For the residents and visitors to Miami Beach, the murder served as a jarring reminder that violence can erupt anywhere, at any time, even on a beautiful sunny morning in a glamorous neighborhood where wealthy residents and tourists gather to enjoy the Florida sunshine and Ocean Drive's distinctive Art Deco charm. The Versace family, while continuing to build the fashion empire that Gianni had created, has maintained a dignified approach to discussing the murder, focusing on celebrating his creative legacy rather than dwelling on the violence that ended his life. Though the loss clearly created a void that can never be filled and changed the trajectory of the Versace brand in ways both subtle and profound. Today, more than 2 decades after that July morning when 2 gunshots shattered the peace of Ocean Drive and ended one of fashion's brightest lights, Gianni Versace is remembered primarily for his contributions to style, beauty, and creative expression. But the manner of his death remains an inescapable part of his story, a shocking example of how a deeply disturbed individual can destroy in seconds what took a lifetime of talent and dedication to build, and a reminder that even the most successful, beloved, and seemingly secure among us can fall victim to senseless violence committed in broad daylight by someone whose motivations may never be fully understood or rationally explained. Number 3. The Cheshire Home Invasion Murders, a quiet neighborhood's worst nightmare. On the morning of July 23, 2007, the Petit family of Cheshire, Connecticut, awoke in their comfortable single-family home on Sorghum Mill Drive, completely unaware that 2 men had been watching their house throughout the night and were preparing to invade their home in a crime that would become one of the most horrific and widely publicized home invasion cases in American history. Dr. William Petit, a prominent endocrinologist in the community, his wife Jennifer Hawk Petit, and their 2 daughters, 17-year-old Haley and 11-year-old Michaela, represented the epitome of an accomplished, close-knit American family, active in their community, successful in their respective pursuits, and living what appeared to be an idyllic suburban life that would be shattered in the most devastating way imaginable. Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky, both career criminals with extensive records and recent releases from Connecticut's criminal justice system, had spotted Jennifer and Michaela Petit at a local supermarket the previous evening and, in a decision that reflected both predatory calculation and staggering moral depravity, followed them home and spent hours surveilling the residence while formulating their plan to rob the family. At approximately 3 a.m. on July 23rd, Komisarjevsky, who had a history of burglaries and had been released on parole despite his lengthy criminal record, pried open a basement door and entered the Petit home while Hayes waited outside. And once inside, Komisarjevsky located Dr. Petit, who had fallen asleep on a couch in the sunroom after watching television. Komisarjevsky struck Dr. Petit in the head with a baseball bat he found in the home, rendering the physician semi-conscious and disoriented, then used plastic zip ties to bind his hands and feet before dragging him to the basement where he was secured to a pole. Hayes then entered the home and the two intruders proceeded upstairs where they found Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela sleeping in their bedrooms, and in a scene of unimaginable terror, they awakened the three females and tied them to their beds, with the mother and daughters now fully aware that strangers had invaded their home and that their husband and father had been neutralized and was somewhere in the house, unable to protect them. What followed over the next several hours was a prolonged ordeal of torture, sexual assault, and psychological torment as Hayes and Komisarjevsky held the family captive while debating what to do next, searching the house for valuables, and committing acts of sexual violence that would later be detailed in court testimony that shocked even experienced prosecutors and investigators. As morning arrived and the sun rose over the quiet Cheshire neighborhood where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved to each other on their way to work, the Petit family was enduring a nightmare behind the closed doors of their home, while the two intruders discussed how to extract money from the family and eliminate witnesses to their crimes. The perpetrators discovered that the Petit had a Bank of America account, and in one of the most chilling aspects of the crime, they forced Jennifer Petit to agree to go to the bank when it opened and withdraw money while they held her daughters hostage, threatening that if she alerted authorities or failed to return with the cash, Haley and Michaela would be killed. At approximately 9 a.m., Hayes drove Jennifer to the Bank of America branch on Main Street in Cheshire, walked her inside while staying close to ensure compliance, and waited as she approached a teller and requested a withdrawal of $15,000, explaining that she needed the money for her husband's business. The bank teller, sensing something was wrong with Jennifer's demeanor and concerned by the unusual nature of the request and the presence of the man accompanying her, discreetly contacted the bank manager, who then called 911 to report a possible robbery in progress, providing dispatchers with a description of Jennifer, the suspicious man with her, and the vehicle they had arrived in. Jennifer completed the withdrawal, received the cash, and returned to the vehicle with Hayes, and they drove back to the Sorghum Mill Drive residence where Komisarjevsky was still holding Dr. Petit and the two girls captive, completely unaware that police had been notified and were beginning to respond. What happened during the approximately 30 minutes between Jennifer's return to the house with the money and the arrival of police would become the subject of intense scrutiny, criticism of police response protocols, and agonized questions about whether different tactical decisions might have prevented the ultimate tragedy. Inside the Petit home, Hayes and Komisarjevsky, now in possession of the $15,000 and apparently deciding that they needed to eliminate all witnesses to their crimes, began their final horrific acts. Jennifer Petit was strangled to death in the master bedroom, her body left on the floor while her daughters remained tied to their beds in their respective rooms, unable to help their mother and terrified about what would happen to them. Komisarjevsky and Hayes then poured gasoline throughout the house, dousing the floors, furniture, and even the beds where Haley and Michaela remained bound and helpless, and as the two girls pleaded for their lives and screamed for help that would not arrive in time, the intruders set the house on fire and attempted to flee in the Petit family's vehicle. Meanwhile, Cheshire police officers had been setting up a perimeter around the residence, following protocols that emphasized containing the scene and waiting for tactical units to arrive, rather than immediately entering a potentially dangerous hostage situation. A decision that would later be questioned extensively as the house erupted in flames with the two girls still inside. Dr. Petit, still in the basement and badly injured from the earlier attack, somehow managed to escape his restraints as the fire began to spread, and despite his injuries and disoriented state, he made his way out of the basement and into the yard where he collapsed, shouting desperately for help and trying to alert anyone who could hear that his family was still inside the burning house. Officers observed Hayes and Komisarjevsky attempting to leave in the family's vehicle and immediately intercepted them, with both suspects being taken into custody at the scene after a brief attempt to flee on foot. And while the capture of the perpetrators happened swiftly, the response to the fire and the rescue of potential survivors inside the home became a frantic and ultimately tragic race against time. Firefighters arrived and began battling the blaze while searching for survivors. But the gasoline-accelerated fire had spread with devastating speed and intensity throughout the wooden structure, creating conditions that made immediate entry extremely dangerous. When firefighters finally gained access to the second floor and located Haley and Michaela Petit, both girls were found still tied to their beds, and despite immediate efforts to resuscitate them, both were pronounced dead, having succumbed to smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Their final moments unimaginable in their terror as they understood they were going to die while bound and helpless in their own bedrooms. Dr. William Petit survived his injuries and was transported to a hospital where he would physically recover, though the psychological and emotional devastation of losing his wife and both daughters in such horrific circumstances would mark him forever, transforming him from a respected physician living a comfortable life into a widower and bereaved father whose family had been destroyed in a single morning by two men who had invaded his home. The investigation and subsequent prosecutions of Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky became major news stories in Connecticut and nationally, with both men facing capital murder charges in a state that had the death penalty at the time but rarely used it, and the details that emerged during pretrial proceedings and the trials themselves revealed the full extent of the horror the Petit family had endured. Evidence presented at trial included the fact that Komisarjevsky had sexually assaulted 11-year-old Michaela Petit and had photographed the assault with his cell phone, images that investigators had to examine and that would be described in court testimony though mercifully not shown to the public, and that Hayes had sexually assaulted and murdered Jennifer Hawk Petit after forcing her to withdraw the money from the bank. The trials also revealed that both perpetrators had extensive criminal histories that should have kept them incarcerated, but had been released through a combination of plea bargains, early release programs, and parole decisions that failed to adequately assess the danger they posed, leading to widespread criticism of Connecticut's criminal justice system and calls for reform. Stephen Hayes was tried first, with his trial beginning in September 2010, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his participation in the murders, including his own confessions to police, physical evidence from the scene, bank surveillance footage showing him with Jennifer Petit, and testimony from Dr. Petit who, despite his profound grief and trauma, took the stand to describe the night his family was destroyed. The defense attempted to argue that Komisarjevsky had been the primary instigator and that Hayes had not intended for anyone to die, but this argument was undermined by the evidence showing Hayes had strangled Jennifer Petit to death and had actively participated in pouring gasoline and setting the fire that killed the two girls. On November 8, 2010, the jury convicted Hayes on all 16 counts against him, including capital murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, burglary, and arson. And after a penalty phase during which jurors heard victim impact statements from Dr. Petit and other family members describing the devastating loss, the same jury voted unanimously to sentence Hayes to death. Joshua Komisarjevsky's trial followed in 2011, and despite his defense team's attempts to portray him as suffering from severe mental illness and a traumatic childhood that included sexual abuse, the evidence of his calculated actions, his sexual assault of 11-year-old Michaela, and his equal participation in the murders and arson led to his conviction on all 17 counts against him. On December 9, 2011, Komisarjevsky was also sentenced to death by a jury that rejected any mitigating factors as outweighing the heinous nature of his crimes. However, in a development that would frustrate advocates for victims' rights and disappoint Dr. Petit and his supporters, Connecticut abolished the death penalty in 2012, and although the law was not initially retroactive, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that the death penalty was unconstitutional under the state constitution, meaning that the sentences for all inmates on death row, including Hayes and Komisarjevsky, were commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Cheshire home invasion murders prompted extensive analysis of multiple systemic failures that allowed the crime to occur, including questions about why Hayes and Komisarjevsky had been released from prison despite their criminal histories, why the parole system had not more effectively supervised them after release, whether police response protocols that emphasized perimeter containment over immediate tactical entry were appropriate for evolving situations like this one, and how banks and other institutions should respond when they suspect customers are being coerced. The Connecticut legislature passed new laws in response to the case, including tougher penalties for home invasion, reforms to the parole system, and increased funding for victim services, though no legislative changes could undo the tragedy or restore the Petit family. Dr. William Petit, after recovering from his physical injuries, became an advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform, establishing the Petit Family Foundation in memory of his wife and daughters to provide scholarships and support for education and community programs, channeling his grief into efforts to honor their memory and prevent other families from suffering similar tragedies. The Cheshire community, deeply shaken by the realization that such horrific violence could occur in broad daylight in their quiet town, while children were getting ready for school and neighbors were beginning their ordinary routines, held vigils and memorial services for the Petit family, and engaged in extensive discussions about home security, community watch programs, and the balance between privacy and safety. The crime scene on Sorghum Mill Drive, once a home filled with the normal activities of a successful family, was so damaged by the fire that it had to be demolished, and the property eventually sold to new owners who built a different structure on the land, though for many in Cheshire the address remains forever associated with one of Connecticut's most devastating crimes. The case has been studied by law enforcement agencies, emergency response teams, and criminal justice experts as an example of how multiple system failures can converge to enable catastrophic violence, how tactical response protocols must balance caution with urgency, and how the actions of even a single alert bank employee can provide crucial information to law enforcement, even if that information ultimately comes too late to prevent tragedy. For Dr. William Petit, who eventually remarried and started a new family, creating life and hope from unimaginable loss, the memory of that July morning when he woke up on his couch to a blow to the head that would begin the worst day any person could endure remains a defining trauma. But his resilience in building a new life while honoring the memory of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela has inspired many who have followed his story. The Cheshire home invasion murders stand as one of the most disturbing examples of crimes committed in broad daylight, as while the initial invasion occurred in darkness, the culminating horrors unfolded during morning hours when the neighborhood was waking up, when the bank was conducting regular business, when police were actively responding to the scene, and when firefighters were racing to save lives, making the fact that two innocent children died tied to their beds while their home burned around them all the more devastating because it happened not in some remote location but in a suburban Connecticut town, in a house surrounded by neighbors, during daylight hours when help should have been available but arrived just moments too late to prevent an unspeakable tragedy that would forever change how Connecticut approaches criminal justice, parole decisions, and emergency response to home invasions. Number 4. The murder of Kitty Genovese. The crime that changed America's understanding of bystander effect. On March 13, 1964, in the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens, New York, 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese finished her shift as a bar manager at Ev's 11th Hour Sports Bar in Hollis and began the short drive home to her apartment at 82-70 Austin Street, a routine she had completed countless times before without incident. Genovese, who was known to friends and family as friendly, hardworking, and well-liked in her community, arrived in Kew Gardens at approximately 3:15 a.m. and parked her red Fiat in the Long Island Railroad parking lot near her apartment building, as was her usual practice since tenant parking was limited at her building. As she walked from her car toward her apartment entrance, traveling a distance of only about 100 feet through a relatively well-lit area, she was attacked by Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old business machine operator who lived in nearby Richmond Hill and who had been driving through the neighborhood looking for a victim to assault and rob. Mosley, who would later be revealed as a serial killer who had already murdered at least 2 other women, approached Genovese from behind with a hunting knife and stabbed her in the back, causing her to scream for help as she tried to escape toward her apartment building. The initial attack occurred in full view of the apartment buildings that lined Austin Street, and Genovese's screams pierced the quiet early morning air, with at least some residents hearing the commotion and at least one person shouting from a window for the attacker to leave the woman alone. Mosley, startled by the shout and concerned that he might be caught, temporarily fled the scene, running back to his car and driving away while Genovese, badly wounded but still alive, attempted to make her way around the building toward her apartment entrance, bleeding heavily and likely going into shock from her injuries. What happened next would become the most controversial and debated aspect of the case, as Mosley, rather than fleeing the area entirely, instead drove around the block and then returned to the scene approximately 10 minutes later, finding Genovese in the hallway at the back of the building where she had collapsed, still alive but unable to defend herself or escape. Mosley resumed his attack with devastating brutality, stabbing Genovese repeatedly, sexually assaulting her, and stealing the $49 she had in her purse, leaving her to die in the hallway of her own apartment building, while neighbors who may have heard the initial attack did not call police or intervene during this second, fatal assault. A friend and neighbor of Genovese's named Sophia Farrar did eventually come to her aid, cradling the dying woman and calling for help. But by this time Genovese had suffered catastrophic injuries including multiple stab wounds, and despite the arrival of an ambulance and transport to Queens General Hospital, she was pronounced dead at 4:15 a.m. from her injuries, having endured a prolonged and terrifying attack that unfolded over approximately half an hour in a residential neighborhood. The initial police investigation focused on identifying and apprehending the killer, with detectives canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing residents about what they had seen or heard during the early morning hours of March 13th. And while the investigation was proceeding, what would become the most famous aspect of the Kitty Genovese case had not yet emerged into public consciousness. On March 27, 1964, 2 weeks after the murder, the New York Times published an article with the headline 37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police. Written by reporter Martin Gansberg based on information provided by the NYPD, and this article claimed that 38 witnesses had observed the attack on Genovese from their apartment windows but had failed to call police or intervene, with the story portraying a chilling picture of urban apathy and the breakdown of community responsibility in modern American cities. The article shocked the nation and prompted widespread discussion about what became known as the bystander effect or Genovese syndrome, the psychological phenomenon whereby individuals are less likely to help a victim when other people are present, apparently due to a diffusion of responsibility where each person assumes someone else will take action. The Genovese case became a cultural touchstone, referenced in psychology textbooks, debated in ethics classes, and cited as evidence of societal decay, the alienation of modern urban life, and the erosion of traditional community values that would have compelled neighbors to help someone in distress. However, subsequent investigations and research have revealed that the original New York Times story was significantly inaccurate, and that the narrative of 38 witnesses callously watching a murder without helping was a distortion of what actually happened that night. Modern analysis of the case has shown that while some neighbors did hear screams or commotion, very few actually witnessed the attack itself due to the layout of the buildings, the darkness, the difficulty of seeing what was happening from apartment windows, and the confusion about what exactly was occurring, with some people believing they were hearing a domestic dispute or drunken argument rather than a murder in progress. Additionally, at least one person did call the police during the initial attack, though the records of this call were not preserved or were overlooked during the initial investigation, and several neighbors did respond in various ways including shouting at the attacker, which caused him to flee temporarily, and coming to Genovese's aid after the attack was over, though these actions did not prevent her death. The apprehension of Winston Moseley came through traditional detective work rather than witness cooperation, as he was arrested on March 18, 1964, for an unrelated burglary in Corona, Queens, and during interrogation about that crime, he confessed not only to killing Kitty Genovese but also to 2 other murders and numerous sexual assaults, revealing himself to be a serial predator who had been operating in the New York area for months. Moseley's confession to the Genovese murder included disturbing details about how he had specifically gone out that night looking for a woman to attack, how he had chosen Genovese randomly simply because she was alone and vulnerable, and how he had returned to the scene after fleeing initially because he wanted to finish what he started, demonstrating a level of callousness and predatory calculation that made clear his extreme danger to society. At his trial, Moseley's defense attorneys attempted to argue that he was insane and should not be held fully responsible for his actions, but the prosecution presented compelling evidence of premeditation, including his own statements about planning to find a victim, his systematic approach to the crime, and his ability to flee when he thought he might be caught and then return when he felt safe, all of which demonstrated rational decision-making inconsistent with legal insanity. On June 11, 1964, after deliberating for 7 hours, the jury convicted Winston Moseley of first-degree murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to death in the electric chair, though this sentence would later be commuted to life in prison when the death penalty was temporarily abolished in New York in 1967. Moseley would spend the rest of his life in prison, though not without creating additional trauma and terror, as in 1968 he escaped from custody during a hospital visit, held hostages, sexually assaulted a woman, and was involved in a shootout with police before being recaptured. And throughout his decades of incarceration, he repeatedly sought parole and made various claims about the Genovese murder that were contradicted by the evidence, including bizarre assertions that she had somehow provoked the attack or that he had not intended to kill her. Winston Moseley died in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81, having served 52 years of his sentence and having been denied parole 18 times, with his death bringing a measure of closure to those who remembered Kitty Genovese, though it also meant that he would never face the death penalty for his crimes. The legacy of the Kitty Genovese case extends far beyond the individual tragedy of her murder, as it sparked decades of psychological research into bystander intervention, led to the development of 911 emergency call systems in many American cities, inspired countless discussions about civic responsibility and community engagement, and became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming someone else will help in an emergency. Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané conducted groundbreaking experiments in the years following the Genovese murder to study the bystander effect systematically, and their research confirmed that people are indeed less likely to help when they believe others are present who could also intervene, a finding that has been replicated in numerous studies and has important implications for public safety, emergency response, and social psychology. The inaccuracies in the original reporting of the case have also made it an important example in journalism ethics, demonstrating how a compelling narrative can persist even when it is not fully supported by facts, and how media coverage can shape public perception of events in ways that may not align with reality, with modern journalists and media critics using the Genovese case to illustrate the importance of careful fact-checking and the dangers of sensationalism. For the Genovese family, particularly Kitty's younger brother Bill Genovese, the murder and its aftermath represented a lifelong trauma and a quest for truth about what really happened that night, with Bill eventually producing a documentary film called The Witness that examined the case in depth, challenged the myth of the 38 witnesses, and sought to honor his sister's memory by presenting a more accurate account of her death and the circumstances surrounding it. The Kew Gardens neighborhood where the murder occurred has changed significantly in the decades since 1964, but the site where Kitty Genovese died remains a place of pilgrimage for those interested in true crime history, psychology students studying the bystander effect, and people who simply want to pay their respects to a young woman whose death became a symbol of something much larger than her individual tragedy. The question of whether neighbors could or should have done more to help Kitty Genovese continues to be debated, with modern understanding suggesting that the failure to act was not primarily due to callousness or apathy, but rather to a combination of psychological factors, environmental confusion, and the human tendency to assume someone else will take responsibility, though this explanation does not eliminate the tragedy or lessen the loss. Kitty Genovese's murder in the early morning hours of March 13, 1964, occurred during a time when darkness provided some cover to her attacker, but it unfolded in a residential area with nearby witnesses and concluded in daylight hours as emergency responders arrived. And while the exact chronology places parts of the attack in darkness, the broader context of the crime, occurring in an urban neighborhood where people were present and aware, fits the pattern of shocking crimes that happen when we expect to be safe. The case remains one of the most studied and referenced murders in American history, not because of any particular innovation in criminal technique or remarkable aspect of the investigation, but because of what it revealed or was perceived to reveal about human nature, social responsibility, and the psychological barriers that can prevent ordinary people from helping someone in desperate need, even when that help might save a life. Today, when emergency response systems encourage immediate reporting of suspicious activity, when see something, say something campaigns try to overcome bystander hesitation, and when discussions of civic duty emphasize individual responsibility to act rather than assuming others will intervene, the shadow of Kitty Genovese's murder falls across these efforts, a reminder of what can happen when people fail to act and a motivation to ensure that such failures are not repeated. Even as we recognize that the actual circumstances of that March morning were more complex, more ambiguous, and less clear-cut than the mythology that developed around them. Number 5. The failed assassination of Ronald Reagan. When gunshots erupted outside the Washington Hilton on March 30, 1981, President Ronald Reagan, who had been in office for only 69 days following his inauguration in January, departed the Washington Hilton Hotel on Connecticut Avenue after delivering a speech to members of the AFL-CIO, a routine public appearance that had proceeded without incident and was concluding in the early afternoon around 2:27 p.m. as the president prepared to return to the White House. Reagan, accompanied by his Secret Service detail, White House Press Secretary James Brady, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, and Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer Thomas Delahanty, exited through the hotel's VIP entrance and walked toward his waiting limousine, waving to the small crowd of onlookers and media personnel who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the relatively new president. Among the crowd, positioned only 15 feet from the president, stood John Hinckley Jr., a 25-year-old drifter from Colorado who had been stalking Reagan for months as part of an obsessive fixation on actress Jodie Foster, whom Hinckley believed he could impress and win over by assassinating the president, a delusional plan inspired by his repeated viewings of the film Taxi Driver, in which a character attempts to assassinate a political figure to gain the attention of a woman. As Reagan waved to the crowd and prepared to enter his limousine, Hinckley suddenly assumed a combat stance, raised a .22 caliber Rome RG-14 revolver he had purchased at a Dallas pawn shop, and fired 6 shots in rapid succession. All of this happening in approximately 1.7 seconds in broad daylight on a busy Washington, D.C. street while news cameras were rolling and capturing every moment of the attempted assassination. The first bullet hit White House Press Secretary James Brady in the head, striking him above his left eye and causing catastrophic brain damage that would leave him permanently disabled and eventually contribute to his death 33 years later, making him the longest delayed fatality from a shooting in medical history. The second bullet hit D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty in the back of his neck as he turned toward the sound of gunfire, severing a nerve and causing permanent injury that would end his career in law enforcement. The third and fourth bullets struck the bulletproof window of the presidential limousine and the wall of the building respectively, missing all human targets. The fifth bullet hit Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy in the abdomen as he courageously spread his arms and positioned his body between the shooter and the president, deliberately making himself a human shield in an act of selfless protection that likely saved Reagan's life. The sixth and final bullet, fired as Secret Service agent Jerry Parr was pushing Reagan into the limousine, struck the armored side of the vehicle and ricocheted off at a precise angle that caused it to slip through the narrow gap between the open rear door and the vehicle frame, striking President Reagan under his left arm and penetrating his chest, though neither Reagan nor his protective detail initially realized the president had been hit. Secret Service agent Jerry Parr, acting on his training and instinct, immediately forced Reagan into the limousine and ordered the driver to rush to the White House, believing the president was unharmed and that the priority was to evacuate him from the scene as quickly as possible while other agents subdued the shooter. Hinckley was tackled and disarmed by Secret Service agents and D.C. police officers within seconds of firing his last shot, with the entire incident from the first gunshot to Hinckley's capture lasting less than 10 seconds, and he was immediately taken into custody while the chaos of the shooting scene unfolded with injured men on the ground, witnesses screaming, and emergency responders rushing to provide aid. Inside the limousine, President Reagan initially believed he had simply been injured when Agent Parr pushed him into the vehicle. But as the car sped toward the White House, Reagan began coughing up bright red blood, a sign of serious internal bleeding, and complained of difficulty breathing and sharp pain in his chest. Agent Parr, recognizing these symptoms as potentially life-threatening, made the critical decision to divert to George Washington University Hospital instead of continuing to the White House, a choice that almost certainly saved Reagan's life as the president's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Reagan walked into the hospital emergency room under his own power, maintaining his composure and even joking with the medical staff, but he collapsed almost immediately after entering, having lost nearly half his blood volume from internal hemorrhaging caused by the bullet that had lodged in his lung approximately 1 inch from his heart. The medical team at George Washington University Hospital, led by Dr. Benjamin Aaron, quickly assessed the severity of Reagan's injury and rushed him into emergency surgery, removing a .22 caliber bullet that had caused significant damage to his lung tissue and narrowly avoided striking his heart. And during the operation, Reagan's condition was so precarious that he came close to dying on the operating table due to blood loss and the trauma to his system. While surgeons worked to save the president's life, the nation and the world watched in shock as news broadcasts reported the shooting and provided updates on the conditions of the wounded men, with initial reports creating confusion about whether Reagan had actually been hit and how serious his injuries might be, until the White House confirmed that the president was in surgery and his condition was serious. Press Secretary James Brady's injuries were so severe that some news organizations initially reported he had died, a mistake that was later corrected but which added to the confusion and anxiety of those first hours after the shooting, and Brady's wife Sarah and the families of the other victims endured agonizing waits for information about their loved ones' conditions. President Reagan survived the surgery and began a recovery that would take weeks, during which he demonstrated remarkable resilience and good humor, famously quipping to his wife Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck," and asking the surgeons, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." Jokes that endeared him to the public and helped reassure a nervous nation that their president would recover. The investigation into John Hinckley Jr. revealed a deeply disturbed young man who had been suffering from severe mental illness, including erotomania, a delusional disorder characterized by the belief that another person, usually of higher social status, is in love with the patient, and in Hinckley's case, his delusion centered on actress Jodie Foster, whom he had been stalking, and to whom he had written numerous letters expressing his obsessive fixation. Hinckley had traveled around the country following President Reagan, staying in hotels near the president's appearances and waiting for an opportunity to carry out his assassination attempt, and he had actually been in Nashville on October 9, 1980, during the presidential campaign, where he was arrested for possession of firearms at the airport, a charge that was handled as a minor offense and resulted only in the confiscation of his guns and a small fine, allowing him to continue his stalking behavior unchecked. On the morning of March 30th, Hinckley had written a letter to Jodie Foster explaining his plan to assassinate President Reagan and expressing his belief that this act would somehow demonstrate his love for her and convince her to reciprocate his feelings, a letter that demonstrated both premeditation and the profound delusional thinking that motivated the attack. At his trial, which began in 1982, Hinckley's defense team pursued an insanity defense, arguing that he was suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the shooting and could not be held criminally responsible for his actions, while prosecutors argued that Hinckley's detailed planning and ability to carry out the attack demonstrated he knew what he was doing was wrong and should be held accountable. The trial included extensive psychiatric testimony from experts on both sides, with some psychiatrists diagnosing Hinckley with schizophrenia and other serious mental disorders, while others argued that he was legally sane at the time of the offense, and the jury heard evidence about Hinckley's obsession with Taxi Driver, his stalking of Jodie Foster, and his deteriorating mental state in the months before the assassination attempt. On June 21, 1982, after 7 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury found John Hinckley Jr. not guilty by reason of insanity on all 13 counts, including the attempted assassination of the president, and he was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., where he would remain for more than 3 decades. The verdict sparked outrage among many Americans who believed Hinckley should have been convicted and imprisoned for his attack on the president and the injuries he inflicted on 4 men, and the case led to significant changes in federal and state insanity defense laws, with many jurisdictions making it more difficult to successfully use this defense or creating a new verdict option of guilty but mentally ill. James Brady never fully recovered from his injuries and remained partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired for the rest of his life, though he and his wife Sarah became prominent advocates for gun control, with the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act being passed in 1993 requiring background checks for firearm purchases, a law that bears his name and stands as his legacy. Officer Thomas Delahanty retired from the police force due to his injuries and dealt with chronic pain for the rest of his life, while Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy recovered from his abdominal wound and returned to duty, eventually becoming the chief of police in Orland Park, Illinois, though he carried the physical and psychological scars of taking a bullet meant for the president. President Reagan made a full recovery from his physical injuries and returned to active duty in the White House, serving out both his terms in office and living until 2004, though some historians and medical experts have speculated that the trauma of the shooting and the surgery may have had longer-term effects on his health. John Hinckley Jr. remained at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for 35 years, undergoing treatment for his mental illness and gradually being granted increasing levels of freedom, including supervised visits with his family and eventually unsupervised visits, a progression that generated controversy and concern from victims' advocates and some members of the public who believed he should never be released. In 2016, after lengthy court proceedings and extensive evaluation of his mental state, a federal judge ruled that Hinckley could be released from St. Elizabeth's to live full-time with his mother in Williamsburg, Virginia, under certain restrictions and conditions, a decision that James Brady's widow Sarah Brady strongly opposed, though the court determined that Hinckley no longer posed a danger to himself or others. The restrictions on Hinckley were gradually loosened, and in 2022, he was granted unconditional release, freed from all court supervision and allowed to live independently, a decision that came more than 41 years after the shooting and sparked renewed debate about justice, mental illness, and whether someone who attempted to assassinate a president should ever be fully released into society. The attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan remains one of the most dramatic moments in modern American presidential history, captured on film and broadcast around the world, showing in stark detail how quickly violence can erupt even in the most protected and controlled environments, and how the courage of Secret Service agents willing to take bullets for the president can mean the difference between a wounded leader who survives and a national catastrophe. The shooting also highlighted the persistent threat of mentally ill individuals fixating on public figures, the challenges of identifying and preventing such attacks before they occur, and the difficulties of balancing civil liberties with public safety when dealing with people who may be dangerous due to psychiatric conditions. For the Secret Service, the Reagan shooting led to significant changes in protective protocols, including adjustments to formation positions, enhanced threat assessment procedures, and improved coordination with local law enforcement, all designed to prevent another attacker from getting so close to the president and firing so many shots before being stopped. The fact that this attempted assassination occurred in broad daylight, outside a major hotel in the nation's capital, in front of news cameras and multiple witnesses, with the president surrounded by trained protective agents, underscores the reality that determined attackers can strike anywhere, anytime, and that even the most sophisticated security measures cannot eliminate all risk, only reduce it. The image of President Reagan waving to the crowd just seconds before shots rang out, the chaos as Secret Service agents responded, the sight of wounded men on the ground, and the speed with which the situation unfolded from normal to catastrophic remains seared into the memory of those who witnessed it, either in person or through the television coverage that brought the event into millions of homes in real time. Today, when presidents travel with even more extensive security measures and when threat assessment has become increasingly sophisticated, the Reagan assassination attempt serves as a reminder of why such precautions are necessary and how thin the line can be between a routine public appearance and a national tragedy. With John Hinckley Jr.'s 6 shots fired in 1.7 seconds nearly changing the course of American history and creating a different world than the one we inhabit today. Number 6. The Texas Tower shooting, when a sniper turned a university into a killing ground on August 1, 1966. The University of Texas at Austin campus was bathed in bright Texas sunshine as students, faculty, and visitors went about their normal activities on what should have been an ordinary summer day, completely unaware that Charles Whitman, a 25-year-old former Marine and architectural engineering student, had already murdered his mother and wife during the previous night and was now preparing to carry out one of the first mass shootings in modern American history from atop the university's iconic 307-foot observation deck of the main building tower. Whitman had spent the early morning hours of August 1st loading a footlocker and duffel bag with weapons, ammunition, supplies, and food, assembling an arsenal that included a Remington 706mm bolt-action hunting rifle equipped with a telescopic sight, a .35 caliber pump rifle, a .30 caliber semi-automatic carbine, a 9mm Luger pistol, a .357 Magnum revolver, a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, and approximately 700 rounds of ammunition, along with other supplies including water, gasoline, rope, binoculars, earplugs, a transistor radio, toilet paper, and even deodorant and sandwiches, demonstrating a level of planning that indicated he intended to remain in position for an extended period. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Whitman arrived at the University of Texas campus dressed in blue coveralls and carrying his footlocker and duffel bag on a rental dolly, looking like a maintenance worker or delivery person, and he entered the main building and took the elevator to the 27th floor, then climbed the stairs to the 28th floor reception area where Edna Townsley, a 51-year-old receptionist, was working at her desk. Whitman approached Mrs. Townsley and struck her on the head with the butt of his rifle, fracturing her skull and leaving her dying on the floor. Then he barricaded the stairway door with furniture to prevent anyone from easily accessing the observation deck, creating a defensive position from which he could conduct his planned shooting spree. As Whitman was setting up his position, a young couple, Mark and Mary Gabauer, along with Mary's mother and sister Marguerite Lamport and Mike Gabauer, arrived at the observation deck as tourists wanting to enjoy the view of Austin from the tower's height, and when they encountered Whitman in the reception area, he opened fire with his shotgun, killing Marguerite Lamport and Mike Gabauer instantly and severely wounding Mark and Mary Gabauer and Mary's sister, leaving the survivors hiding and bleeding in the stairwell. With his position secured and having already killed 3 people inside the tower, Whitman ascended to the observation deck at approximately 11:48 a.m. and began shooting at people on the ground below with his rifles, firing his first shots toward the South Mall area where students and faculty were walking between buildings, sitting on benches, or simply enjoying the summer day with no warning that death was about to rain down from above. The first victim to be shot on the ground was Claire Wilson, a pregnant 18-year-old anthropology student who was walking across the South Mall with her boyfriend Thomas Ekman when a bullet from Whitman's rifle struck her in the abdomen, killing her unborn child instantly, and seconds later another shot killed Thomas Ekman, who had turned to help Claire, leaving both of them lying exposed on the plaza with Claire still alive but unable to move while Whitman continued to fire at anyone who came into his sights. For the next 96 minutes, Charles Whitman methodically fired shot after shot from his elevated position, targeting people at distances ranging from 50 to 500 yards away, demonstrating the marksmanship skills he had developed as a Marine sharpshooter and exploiting the tactical advantage of height, cover, and surprise against victims who initially had no idea where the shots were coming from or how to protect themselves. The confusion on the ground was absolute as people heard gunshots and saw others falling but couldn't immediately identify the source of the fire, with some initially believing there was a sniper in one of the surrounding buildings or that multiple shooters were involved. And it took several minutes before witnesses looking up at the tower spotted Whitman moving along the observation deck and pointing his rifle downward. Austin police began receiving emergency calls reporting the shooting at approximately 11:52 a.m., and officers responded to the campus immediately, though they faced an unprecedented situation with no established protocols for dealing with an elevated sniper who could see and shoot at anyone approaching the tower while remaining protected behind the deck's limestone walls. Officer Billy Speed, one of the first Austin Police Department officers to arrive on scene, was shot and killed by Whitman as he attempted to take cover behind a stone railing, the bullet penetrating his body and severing his aorta, making him the first law enforcement officer to die in the incident. Officer Houston McCoy and other responding officers quickly realized that conventional police tactics were useless against a sniper positioned 300 feet above the ground with clear sight lines in all directions, and they began organizing a perimeter while calling for additional resources and trying to evacuate civilians from the areas Whitman could target. Armed civilians, including students and local residents who owned rifles, began returning fire at the observation deck in an improvised response that, while not particularly effective at hitting Whitman due to the distance and his cover, did force him to keep his head down and limited his ability to fire freely at people below, creating suppressing fire that may have saved lives by disrupting his shooting rhythm. As the siege continued and Whitman fired shot after shot, the casualty count mounted with people being hit while walking to class, working in buildings, seeking cover behind trees or walls, or trying to help already wounded victims, and the randomness of who lived and who died came down to inches, angles, and split-second timing as Whitman's bullets found some targets and narrowly missed others. Ramiro Martinez, an Austin police officer who responded to the scene, made the decision along with Officer Houston McCoy and civilian Alan Crum to enter the tower and attempt to stop Whitman directly, ascending through the building while not knowing if Whitman had rigged booby traps or if other shooters might be waiting inside, demonstrating extraordinary courage in advancing toward an armed and elevated shooter who held every tactical advantage. When Martinez, McCoy, and Crum reached the 27th floor, they encountered the barricaded door that Whitman had blocked, and they had to remove furniture and force their way through while expecting gunfire at any moment. Then they carefully climbed to the reception area where they found the bodies of Whitman's victims and had to determine how to access the observation deck, where Whitman continued shooting. The 3 men, now joined by Officer Jerry Day, devised a plan to split up and approach Whitman from different directions, with Martinez and McCoy going clockwise around the observation deck while Crum and Day went counterclockwise, hoping to catch Whitman in a crossfire or at least prevent him from defending all approaches simultaneously. At approximately 1:24 p.m., nearly 96 minutes after Whitman had fired his first shot from the tower, Officer Martinez spotted the gunman on the south side of the observation deck and opened fire with his service revolver, striking Whitman and causing him to drop his rifle. Then Officer McCoy fired his shotgun twice, hitting Whitman in the head and torso and killing him instantly, finally ending the rampage that had terrorized the university and the city of Austin for over an hour and a half. When the shooting finally stopped and investigators accessed the observation deck to process the scene, they found Whitman's body surrounded by his arsenal of weapons, spent shell casings, and the supplies he had brought with him, along with a note he had written explaining that he had been experiencing severe headaches and disturbing thoughts and requesting that an autopsy be performed on his brain after his death. The final casualty count from the Texas Tower shooting was staggering. 18 people dead, including Whitman, his mother, and his wife whom he had killed the night before, plus 31 people wounded, some of whom would carry bullets in their bodies for the rest of their lives because the fragments were too dangerous to remove surgically. The victims ranged from university students and faculty to visitors to the campus, a police officer, and even people who had simply been walking or driving near the university when Whitman's bullets found them, creating a cross-section of Austin society united only by the tragic randomness of being in the wrong place when a madman decided to kill. In the aftermath, investigators found that Whitman had left behind extensive writings, including a note stating, "I do not really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately I cannot recall when it started. I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts," and requesting that after his death an autopsy should determine if there was a physical cause for his mental state. The autopsy revealed that Whitman had a glioblastoma tumor pressing against his amygdala, the part of the brain that regulates emotions and fight-or-flight responses. And while neuroscientists and psychiatrists debated whether this tumor could have contributed to his violent actions, no consensus was reached on whether it causally explained his behavior or simply coincided with other factors, including his history of violence, his troubled relationship with his father, his recent academic and personal failures, and possible steroid use. The University of Texas and the city of Austin were profoundly traumatized by the shooting, with the tower itself becoming a symbol of tragedy rather than pride. And for years afterward, the observation deck was closed to the public as university officials grappled with how to memorialize the victims while preventing the location from becoming a site of morbid fascination. The Texas Tower shooting had a lasting impact on American society and law enforcement, serving as one of the first major mass shooting incidents to receive extensive media coverage and prompting discussions about gun control, mental health services, campus security, and how police should respond to active shooter situations. The heroism of officers Martinez and McCoy, along with civilian Alan Crum, who risked his life to help stop Whitman, demonstrated that stopping an active shooter often requires individuals willing to move toward the danger rather than away from it, a principle that would later be codified in police active shooter response training that emphasizes immediate action rather than waiting for specialized tactical units. For the survivors of the shooting, particularly those like Claire Wilson who lost loved ones or suffered permanent injuries, the trauma extended far beyond the physical wounds, with many struggling with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the psychological impact of having experienced such sudden and random violence in a place they had believed was safe. The University of Texas eventually reopened the observation deck in 1999 after extensive renovations that included installing barriers to prevent anyone from using the location as a shooting platform. Though the reopening was controversial, with some feeling it dishonored the victim's memory, while others believed it was important to reclaim the space and not allow Whitman's actions to permanently alter the university's iconic landmark. The victims of the Texas Tower shooting are commemorated through various memorials on the UT campus, including a garden dedicated to their memory and plaques acknowledging the tragedy. Though for many years the university struggled with how to publicly remember the event without glorifying the perpetrator or causing additional pain to survivors and families. Charles Whitman's motivations remain partially mysterious despite the extensive investigation into his background, his writings, and his mental and physical health, with the most likely explanation being a combination of factors including the brain tumor, psychological issues, stress from academic and personal failures, a violent temperament learned from his abusive father, and perhaps an element of narcissistic rage that he expressed through an act designed to ensure he would never be forgotten. However, infamously, the shooting demonstrated that mass casualty attacks could happen anywhere, even in bright daylight in the middle of a university campus during summer session when thousands of people were present, and that the elevation and tactical positioning of a skilled shooter could create a kill zone that was extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to neutralize quickly. The response by armed civilians who grabbed their own rifles and began shooting back at the tower, while controversial and potentially dangerous, reflected a frontier mindset still present in Texas in 1966 and sparked debates about civilian involvement in active shooter situations that continue to this day in discussions about concealed carry laws and good guy with a gun scenarios. Today, more than 5 decades after Charles Whitman climbed the Texas Tower and began shooting, the incident is studied by law enforcement, criminologists, psychologists, and security professionals as a watershed moment in American violence, the beginning of the modern mass shooting era, and a case study in how individuals, communities, and institutions respond to and recover from acts of inexplicable violence that shatter the assumption of safety in public spaces. The fact that this massacre occurred in broad daylight, visible to thousands, covered by news media as it unfolded, and involving victims who were simply going about normal activities on a summer day, makes it one of the most shocking examples of how violence can erupt suddenly in the most ordinary circumstances, transforming a beautiful August day into a nightmare that would haunt Austin, Texas, and the nation for generations, while the courage of those who rushed toward danger to stop Whitman provides a counterpoint of human heroism in the face of human evil, demonstrating that even in the worst moments, individuals can choose to act selflessly to protect others at tremendous personal risk, a truth that offers some measure of comfort in an event otherwise marked by senseless tragedy and irreplaceable loss. Number 7. The assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald murder broadcast live on national television on November 24, 1963, 2 days after President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald, the 24-year-old former Marine who had been arrested and charged with the president's murder, was being transferred from the Dallas police headquarters to the county jail, a routine prisoner transport that had been scheduled for mid-morning and would take place in the basement of the police building, with dozens of law enforcement officers present and news cameras rolling to capture every moment. The Dallas Police Department, aware of the enormous public interest in Oswald and the unprecedented nature of the case, had allowed news media extensive access to the prisoner transfer, with reporters and camera crews crowding into the basement area to document what was expected to be a straightforward procedural event that would provide dramatic footage but no actual drama. At approximately 11:21 a.m. Central Standard Time, as television networks across the nation broadcast live coverage of the transfer, Oswald was escorted through the basement by Dallas police detectives Jim Lavelle and L.C. Graves, with Lavelle famously handcuffed to Oswald and wearing a light-colored suit that would make him highly visible in the black and white footage that captured what happened next. As Oswald walked toward the armored car that would transport him to the county jail, a man suddenly lunged from the crowd of reporters, extended his right arm, and fired a single shot from a .38 caliber Colt Cobra revolver directly into Oswald's abdomen at point-blank range. The gunshot occurring at 11:21 and 4 seconds a.m. and broadcast live on NBC television, making millions of Americans witnesses to the first murder ever shown on live television as it happened. The shooter was immediately tackled and subdued by police officers who had been standing only feet away, but who had not identified him as a threat until the instant he fired. And as Oswald collapsed to the ground, clutching his abdomen and grimacing in pain, the basement erupted into chaos, with detectives shouting, reporters pushing forward trying to see what had happened, and officers attempting to secure both the wounded prisoner and his attacker. The man who shot Oswald was quickly identified as Jack Ruby, a 52-year-old Dallas nightclub owner who was known to local police officers and who had inserted himself into the investigation over the previous 2 days, attending press conferences, visiting the police station multiple times, and positioning himself in locations where he could observe the proceedings, all while apparently planning to kill Oswald, though whether this was premeditated or an impulsive decision remains debated. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier, and doctors worked frantically to save his life, performing emergency surgery to repair the damage caused by Ruby's bullet, which had torn through his abdomen, damaged major blood vessels including the inferior vena cava, and caused massive internal bleeding that proved impossible to control despite the medical team's best efforts. At 1:07 p.m., approximately 1 hour and 46 minutes after being shot, Lee Harvey Oswald was pronounced dead, taking to his grave any explanations, confessions, or denials he might have offered about President Kennedy's assassination, and ensuring that many questions about the events of November 22 would remain forever unanswered. Jack Ruby was immediately arrested and charged with murder, and as investigators began looking into his background and his actions over the previous 48 hours, they discovered that he had been present at numerous locations connected to the Kennedy assassination aftermath, including the Dallas police headquarters where Oswald was being interrogated, the press conference where Oswald was briefly displayed to reporters, and now the basement where the prisoner transfer was taking place, raising questions about how he had managed to gain access to these secure areas and whether his presence indicated a conspiracy or simply represented a starstruck nightclub owner with connections to Dallas police officers who gave him more access than he should have had. The investigation revealed that Ruby had entered the police headquarters basement through the main street ramp at approximately 11:17 a.m., just minutes before Oswald's transfer was scheduled to begin, and that he had apparently slipped past security at a moment when the officer guarding the ramp had temporarily stepped away to direct traffic, though some conspiracy theorists would later argue that Ruby must have had assistance from corrupt police officers who deliberately allowed him access. Ruby's background showed a complex figure who had been born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911, had changed his name to Jack Ruby, had moved to Dallas in 1947 where he operated various nightclubs and strip clubs including the Carousel Club, had connections to both law enforcement and organized crime figures though the extent and significance of these relationships was disputed, and had a history of violent outbursts and impulsive behavior though nothing in his past suggested he was capable of or interested in political assassination. In the hours and days after shooting Oswald, Ruby gave various explanations for his actions, sometimes claiming he had acted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the ordeal of testifying at Oswald's trial, other times suggesting he had been overcome with grief and rage about the president's death, and occasionally hinting at darker conspiracies though never providing coherent details that could be verified or that made logical sense. Ruby's trial began on March 4, 1964, in Dallas, with his defense team pursuing an insanity defense and arguing that Ruby had suffered a psychomotor epileptic seizure that caused him to lose conscious control of his actions when he shot Oswald, while prosecutors argued that Ruby's actions showed premeditation including his carrying of a loaded gun, his presence at the police station at the exact time of the transfer, and his deliberate insertion of himself into position to access Oswald. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 19 minutes before convicting Jack Ruby of murder with malice, and he was sentenced to death in the electric chair, though this conviction would later be overturned on appeal due to procedural errors and improper admission of evidence, with a new trial ordered to take place in a different venue outside of Dallas where pretrial publicity would be less overwhelming. Before the new trial could take place, Ruby's health deteriorated rapidly, and he was diagnosed with lung cancer that had metastasized throughout his body, leading to his death on January 3, 1967, in Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where both President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald had died, making Ruby the third principal figure in the Kennedy assassination saga to die within a little over 3 years. Ruby's death, like Oswald's before him, meant that many questions would remain permanently unanswered, including whether he had acted entirely alone or as part of a conspiracy, whether his stated motivations for killing Oswald were genuine or cover stories, and whether he had specific knowledge about the Kennedy assassination that he took to his grave. The murder of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby became one of the most analyzed and debated events in American history, spawning countless conspiracy theories that suggested Ruby had been sent to silence Oswald before he could reveal that Kennedy's assassination had been orchestrated by organized crime, anti-Castro Cuban exiles, the Soviet Union, rogue CIA agents, or other shadowy forces, though no credible evidence has ever emerged to definitively prove any of these theories. The Warren Commission, established by President Lyndon Johnson to investigate the Kennedy assassination, concluded that both Oswald and Ruby had acted alone without conspiracy, but this conclusion satisfied few people, and the debate over what really happened in Dallas in November 1963 continues more than 60 years later. The footage of Ruby shooting Oswald, captured by NBC cameraman Robert Jackson and broadcast live to millions of viewers, became one of the most iconic and disturbing pieces of film in television history, marking the first time Americans watched a murder occur in real time on their television screens and contributing to the surreal, nightmarish quality of the entire weekend following Kennedy's assassination. For law enforcement professionals, the Oswald shooting represented a catastrophic security failure that allowed a civilian to access a secure area and murder a prisoner who was surrounded by armed officers, leading to comprehensive reviews of prisoner security protocols and transfer procedures. Though the specific circumstances of that November morning, with the unprecedented media access, the confusion following Kennedy's assassination, and the general assumption that Oswald would be safe in a police station basement, created conditions that would be unlikely to be replicated. The basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters where Oswald was shot has since been closed to public access, though the building remains in use and the area where the shooting occurred is occasionally shown to researchers and journalists, with the exact spot where Ruby fired his fatal shot marked and documented as a significant historical location. The legacy of Jack Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald extends beyond the immediate tragedy of another death in the Kennedy assassination aftermath to encompass broader questions about vigilante justice, the role of media in criminal proceedings, the adequacy of security measures for high-profile prisoners, and the ways that impulsive violent acts can permanently alter the course of history by eliminating key witnesses and ensuring that definitive answers to critical questions can never be attained. For those who witnessed the shooting live on television that Sunday morning, the image of Ruby lunging forward, the sound of the gunshot, Oswald's pained expression as he collapsed, and the chaotic aftermath remains seared into memory as one of the defining moments of a weekend that fundamentally changed America and that demonstrated how quickly violence could erupt even in situations where it should have been impossible, with armed guards present, cameras rolling, and the eyes of the nation watching every moment. The fact that this murder occurred in broad daylight, in a police station basement, surrounded by law enforcement officers, and broadcast live to millions of viewers makes it one of the most shocking and brazen crimes in American history. An act that was simultaneously public and intimate, witnessed by countless people yet understood by none, carried out by a man whose motivations remain murky and whose death prevented any final accounting of why he felt compelled to kill the man accused of killing the president, thereby creating a mystery nested within a mystery that has frustrated investigators, historians, and the public for more than 6 decades, and that serves as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most significant events in history unfold in mere seconds, broadcast for all to see, yet remaining forever shrouded in questions that can never be fully answered because the key actors took their secrets to their graves, leaving the rest of us to endlessly debate, speculate, and search for truth in events that were visible to millions but comprehensible to none. Number 8. The Congressional Baseball Shooting, an attack on American democracy. On the morning of June 14, 2017, Republican members of the United States Congress and their staff members gathered at Eugene Simpson Stadium Park in Alexandria, Virginia, for an early morning baseball practice in preparation for the annual Congressional Baseball game for charity, a beloved bipartisan tradition that had been held since 1909 and that represented one of the few remaining opportunities for members of both parties to interact in a friendly, non-political setting. The practice session began at approximately 6:30 a.m. on a beautiful summer morning, with about 25 people present including congressmen, congressional staffers, and family members, all dressed in casual athletic clothes and focused on preparing for the game that was scheduled for the following day, completely unaware that they were being watched by James Hodgkinson, a 66-year-old man from Belleville, Illinois, who had been living in Alexandria for several weeks and who had a history of violent threats against Republicans and an obsessive hatred of President Donald Trump. At approximately 7:09 a.m., as the practice was in full swing with players taking batting practice, fielding ground balls, and running drills on the baseball diamond, Hodgkinson approached the third base side of the field carrying a 7.62mm semi-automatic rifle and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, and without warning or provocation, he opened fire on the assembled group, immediately striking Capitol Police Officer Crystal Griner in the ankle and congressional staffer Zach Barth in the leg as his first shots tore across the field. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, the third-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives who was playing second base at the time, was struck by a rifle round that entered through his left hip, traveled across his pelvis, and caused catastrophic internal damage including injuries to internal organs and blood vessels, leaving him critically wounded and lying helpless on the infield while the shooting continued around him. The other members of Congress, staffers, and family members who had been on the field immediately dove for cover, taking shelter in the dugouts, behind vehicles in the adjacent parking lot, or simply lying flat on the ground while Hodgkinson methodically fired shot after shot, aiming at people as they ran and demonstrating clear intent to kill as many people as possible. Capitol Police Officers Crystal Griner and David Bailey, who were present solely because Steve Scalise's position in House leadership entitled him to a security detail, immediately engaged Hodgkinson in a firefight despite being outnumbered and outgunned, with Officer Griner continuing to fight despite her wounded ankle and Officer Bailey, armed only with a pistol, attempting to suppress the rifle-armed attacker who had superior firepower and cover behind the third base dugout. For approximately 10 minutes, gunfire echoed across the Alexandria baseball field and the surrounding residential neighborhood, with witnesses reporting hearing dozens of shots and seeing the chaotic scene of people running, taking cover, and trying to help wounded colleagues while the shooter continued his assault, and the two Capitol Police officers fought desperately to protect the assembled group and neutralize the threat. Members of Congress who had no law enforcement or military training found themselves in a combat situation, trying to help wounded friends while avoiding incoming fire, with Representative Mo Brooks famously using his belt as a tourniquet to help staunch the bleeding from Zach Barth's leg wound, and Representative Brad Wenstrup, a former Army surgeon, providing medical assistance to Steve Scalise while the firefight raged around them. Alexandria Police Department officers responded to the scene within minutes of the first 911 calls, arriving to find an active shooter situation and immediately joining the Capitol Police officers in engaging Hodgkinson, who by this time had been wounded himself but continued to fire his weapons until he was struck by multiple rounds from responding officers that incapacitated him and ended his assault. When the shooting finally stopped at approximately 7:19 a.m., 10 minutes after it had begun, 5 people had been shot. Steve Scalise, Crystal Griner, Zach Barth, Matt Mika, a Tyson Foods lobbyist who had been attending the practice, and James Hodgkinson himself, while approximately 50 shots had been fired in total between the attacker and the responding officers, creating a war zone in a quiet Alexandria park on a Wednesday morning. Hodgkinson was taken into custody and transported to George Washington University Hospital where he was treated for his gunshot wounds, but he died from his injuries later that day, eliminating any possibility of prosecuting him or fully understanding all of his motivations through direct testimony, though investigators would later piece together a detailed picture of his background and radicalization. Steve Scalise was transported to MedStar Washington Hospital Center in critical condition, having lost massive amounts of blood and suffered severe internal injuries that required multiple surgeries and weeks of intensive care, with doctors initially uncertain whether he would survive and his condition remaining touch and go for several days as medical teams fought to repair the damage caused by the bullet's path through his body. The other wounded victims, while seriously injured, were in less critical condition than Scalise, with all of them eventually making full or near-full recoveries, though the psychological trauma of surviving an assassination attempt would affect them for much longer than their physical wounds took to heal. The investigation into James Hodgkinson revealed a deeply troubled individual who had become increasingly radicalized in his political views, posting violent and threatening messages on social media directed at Republicans and President Trump, participating in anti-Trump protests and organizations, and demonstrating clear animus toward the political party he targeted in his attack. Investigators discovered that Hodgkinson had been living out of his van in Alexandria for several weeks prior to the shooting, conducting surveillance on the baseball field and apparently planning his attack, with evidence suggesting he had specifically targeted the Republican team practice after confirming through his own observation and possibly social media that members of Congress would be present. The FBI investigation classified the shooting as an act of domestic terrorism and an assassination attempt motivated by political ideology, noting that Hodgkinson's social media history showed a progression from general political frustration to specific threats of violence against Republican politicians, demonstrating radicalization that should have raised red flags but that fell short of the threshold for law enforcement intervention under existing laws. Background checks revealed that Hodgkinson had legally purchased his firearms despite a history that included arrests for domestic violence and other concerning behavior, raising questions about whether current gun purchase screening procedures were adequate to prevent dangerous individuals from obtaining weapons, though the legal standards for denying firearm purchases based on past behavior that did not result in convictions remained unclear and controversial. The Congressional Baseball shooting prompted immediate calls for increased security for members of Congress, better threat assessment procedures for evaluating potential violence against public officials, and renewed debate about political rhetoric and whether the increasingly hostile and divisive nature of American political discourse was creating an environment that encouraged violence. Members of Congress from both parties, shaken by the realization that they had been targeted for assassination simply because of their political affiliation, came together in a rare display of unity, with Democrats and Republicans alike condemning the attack and emphasizing that political disagreements should never result in violence. The Congressional Baseball game for charity, which had been scheduled for the day after the shooting, was postponed briefly but then played on June 15th with enhanced security, and members of both teams wore LSU baseball caps in honor of Steve Scalise, who had played baseball at Louisiana State University, creating an emotional and symbolic moment of bipartisan solidarity in the wake of an attack designed to divide. Steve Scalise's recovery was long and difficult, requiring multiple surgeries, months of rehabilitation, and intense physical therapy to regain his ability to walk and function, but he eventually returned to Congress and to his leadership position, resuming his duties and becoming an advocate for the Capitol Police officers whose bravery had saved his life and the lives of his colleagues. Crystal Griner and David Bailey were hailed as heroes who had prevented what could have been a massacre, with their quick response and willingness to engage an active shooter despite being wounded and outnumbered, preventing Hodgkinson from having free rein to execute defenseless members of Congress, and they were awarded the Medal of Valor and received recognition from Congress and the President for their actions. The broader implications of the Congressional Baseball shooting extended beyond the immediate incident to encompass questions about the safety of elected officials in an era of heightened political polarization, the adequacy of security provided to members of Congress who do not hold leadership positions and therefore lack protective details, and whether the American political system could survive if elected officials became targets for violence every time they ventured into public spaces. The fact that this attack occurred in broad daylight at a public park, during a routine activity that had been publicized in advance and that was supposed to represent bipartisan cooperation rather than political division, underscored how vulnerable even high-ranking government officials are to determined attackers who are willing to plan and execute violent assaults. The Alexandria community, shocked that their peaceful neighborhood had become the site of an attempted political assassination, rallied around the victims and the first responders, with residents expressing both horror at the violence and pride in the Alexandria police officers who had responded so quickly and effectively to stop the shooter. For the members of Congress who survived the attack, particularly those who had been on the field and who had watched colleagues fall wounded while bullets flew around them, the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of the risks inherent in public service and the reality that political violence, which many Americans considered a problem of the past or of other countries, remained a genuine threat in contemporary America. The shooting also highlighted the critical importance of security details for congressional leaders, as the presence of Capitol Police officers Griner and Bailey, who were there solely because Steve Scalise's leadership position entitled him to protection, made the difference between a shooting that wounded 5 people and a massacre that could have killed or wounded dozens of defenseless members of Congress, who would have had no way to fight back or escape from a rifle-armed attacker in an open field. The investigation revealed that Hodgkinson had created a list of names of Republican congressmen, suggesting a level of premeditation and targeting that went beyond a spontaneous violent outburst and indicated he had been planning some type of attack, though whether he had originally intended to target the baseball practice or had other plans that evolved remains unclear. Today, the Congressional Baseball game for charity continues as an annual tradition, played with enhanced security but maintaining its character as a bipartisan event that demonstrates that members of Congress can compete fiercely on the baseball field while respecting each other as colleagues and fellow public servants. Though the shadow of June 14, 2017, hangs over every subsequent game as a reminder of how close America came to losing multiple elected representatives to political violence. The Eugene Simpson Stadium Park in Alexandria, where the shooting occurred, has returned to its normal use as a community baseball field, with no permanent memorial marking the site, though local residents and baseball players who use the field are aware of its place in history and the violence that erupted there on a summer morning. For Steve Scalise, who came within minutes of bleeding to death on that baseball field and who endured a recovery process that tested his physical and mental resilience, the experience reinforced his commitment to public service while also providing a personal understanding of gun violence that has informed his perspective on policy debates, though his positions on gun rights have remained largely unchanged and rooted in his conservative political philosophy. The broader lesson of the Congressional Baseball shooting, that political violence can strike anywhere, and that the increasing polarization and demonization of political opponents creates an environment where some individuals may feel justified in using violence to express their grievances, remains urgent and relevant as American political discourse continues to feature heated rhetoric, personal attacks, and the casting of political opponents as existential threats rather than fellow citizens with different views. The fact that James Hodgkinson was able to conduct surveillance, plan his attack, obtain weapons legally, and execute his assault on a group of congressmen and their staff in broad daylight at a public park demonstrates that even in the nation's capital, with its extensive law enforcement presence and security infrastructure, determined attackers can find opportunities to commit violence if they are willing to plan carefully and accept that they will likely be killed or captured in the process. A sobering reality that challenges assumptions about safety and security in contemporary America. Number 9. The capture of the son of Sam. When a parking ticket led to New York's Most Wanted on the evening of July 31, 1977, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violani sat in Violani's car near the Shore Parkway, enjoying a date that had included dinner and a movie, completely unaware that they were being stalked by David Berkowitz, a 24-year-old postal worker who had spent the previous year terrorizing New York City as the serial killer. Known as the Son of Sam, responsible for a series of shootings that had killed 6 people and wounded 7 others while taunting police and the media with bizarre letters claiming to be commanded by demons. At approximately 2:35 a.m. on the early morning of July 31st, as Moskowitz and Violani sat talking in the parked car under a streetlight, Berkowitz approached from behind, raised a .44 caliber bulldog revolver, the same weapon he had used in all his previous attacks, and fired multiple shots through the passenger side window, striking both victims in the head at close range in broad view of the residential street where neighbors could have been looking out their windows at any moment. Stacy Moskowitz was shot in the head and critically wounded, while Robert Violani was also struck by bullets that caused severe injuries, including damage to his eyes that would leave him legally blind for the rest of his life. And as the shots rang out in the quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, Berkowitz calmly walked back to his vehicle and drove away, believing he had committed another perfect crime that would add to his legend as New York's most elusive serial killer. Stacy Moskowitz was rushed to Kings County Hospital where doctors worked desperately to save her life, but the damage from the gunshot wound to her brain was too severe, and she died 38 hours later on August 1st, becoming the 6th murder victim of the Son of Sam and the catalyst for the investigation that would finally identify and capture the killer who had eluded police for over a year. The investigation into the Moskowitz shooting initially followed the same frustrating pattern as the previous Son of Sam attacks, with few witnesses, little physical evidence, and a killer who seemed to strike randomly and then disappear into the city's population of millions. But this time investigators caught a break that would prove to be the key to solving the entire case. A woman named Kitty Genovese, who lived near the shooting scene, told police that she had witnessed a man acting suspiciously near the location where Moskowitz and Violani had been parked, and more importantly, she had seen a police officer writing parking tickets in the area shortly before the shooting occurred, tickets that had been issued to vehicles parked too close to a fire hydrant. Detective James Justice of the NYPD, following up on this lead with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that separates good investigators from great ones, obtained the parking tickets that had been issued in the area that night and began checking the registration information for each vehicle that had been ticketed, looking for any connection to the Son of Sam case or any indication that one of the vehicle owners might be worth investigating further. One of the tickets had been issued to a cream-colored Ford Galaxy registered to David Berkowitz at an address in Yonkers, and when Detective Justice ran Berkowitz's name through police databases, he discovered that Berkowitz had received a previous summons for a brush fire near his apartment building, a seemingly minor detail that took on new significance when investigators remembered that the Son of Sam had written in one of his letters about setting fires and had been suspected of arson in addition to the shootings. Further investigation revealed that Berkowitz lived in Yonkers near the location where another Son of Sam shooting had occurred, and when detectives began surveilling his apartment building at 35 Pine Street, they observed his Ford Galaxy parked outside and noticed a duffel bag visible on the back seat, along with what appeared to be the handle of a rifle or shotgun protruding from the bag, providing probable cause to believe that Berkowitz might be armed and dangerous. On the evening of August 10, 1977, a massive police operation was organized to arrest David Berkowitz, with dozens of officers and detectives positioned around his apartment building and along potential escape routes, while the plan called for waiting until Berkowitz came out to his vehicle and attempting to take him into custody in the open rather than risking a barricaded suspect situation if they tried to arrest him in his apartment. At approximately 10 p.m., Berkowitz emerged from his apartment building and walked toward his car, carrying a paper bag and appearing relaxed and unsuspecting, and as he reached his vehicle and opened the door, Detective John Falotico approached him from behind, drew his weapon and ordered Berkowitz to freeze, while other officers quickly moved in to surround the suspect and prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. Berkowitz, rather than attempting to flee or fight, simply smiled at the officers and asked, "What took you so long?" in a statement that suggested he had been expecting to be caught, and that may have reflected either relief that his killing spree was over or satisfaction that he would now receive the attention and notoriety he craved. When officers searched Berkowitz's car, they found a loaded .44 caliber bulldog revolver in the paper bag he had been carrying, the same weapon that ballistics would later confirm had been used in all of the Son of Sam shootings, along with detailed maps of previous crime scenes, letters he had been preparing to send to police and newspapers, and other evidence that conclusively linked him to the series of murders and shootings that had terrorized New York City for over a year. The arrest of David Berkowitz as the son of Sam sent shockwaves through New York City and dominated news coverage for weeks, with the revelation that the mysterious serial killer who had evaded one of the largest manhunts in NYPD history turned out to be an unremarkable-looking postal worker who lived alone in a Yonkers apartment building, stunning those who had imagined the perpetrator as some kind of criminal mastermind rather than an ordinary-seeming man with severe mental illness. During interrogation, Berkowitz provided a detailed confession to all of the son of Sam shootings, explaining that he had chosen his victims randomly based on opportunity rather than any specific targeting criteria, though he showed a preference for young women with long brown hair and couples parked in cars in lovers' lanes or quiet neighborhoods, and he claimed that he had been commanded to kill by a demon that spoke to him through his neighbor's dog, a statement that raised immediate questions about his mental competency to stand trial. The psychiatric evaluation of David Berkowitz became a crucial element of the case, with defense attorneys arguing that he was legally insane due to his apparent belief in demonic possession and his claims of hearing voices, while prosecutors and their psychiatric experts argued that Berkowitz's careful planning, his ability to evade detection for over a year, his selection of targets and locations that minimized his risk of capture, and his various statements that seemed to contradict his claims of demonic compulsion all indicated that he understood what he was doing was wrong and was legally sane under New York law. The court ultimately found Berkowitz competent to stand trial, rejecting the insanity defense and clearing the way for prosecution on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, and faced with overwhelming evidence including his own confession, the murder weapon, and various other physical evidence, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to all charges on May 8, 1978, in a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty, which New York had briefly reinstated in exchange for receiving consecutive 25 years to life sentences on each murder count. Judge Joseph Corso accepted the plea agreement and sentenced David Berkowitz to a total of 365 years in prison, ensuring that he would never be released and would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a sentence that brought some measure of satisfaction to the victims' families and to a city that had lived in fear during his year-long reign of terror. In the years since his incarceration, Berkowitz has repeatedly recanted his claims of demonic possession and has stated that he invented the story about the neighbor's dog because he knew it sounded crazy and thought it might help him avoid responsibility, admitting instead that he committed the murders out of rage, sexual frustration, and a desire for fame and attention, though he has also claimed to have found religion in prison and has expressed remorse for his crimes, statements that have been met with skepticism by many observers who question whether his expressions of contrition are genuine or simply another manipulation. The Son of Sam case had a lasting impact on American criminal justice and media law, most notably through the passage of Son of Sam laws in New York and other states, legislation designed to prevent criminals from profiting from their crimes by selling book rights, movie rights, or other commercial opportunities based on their notoriety. Though these laws have faced constitutional challenges over the years, and their effectiveness in actually preventing such profit has been debated. The investigation that led to Berkowitz's capture has been studied extensively by law enforcement agencies as an example of how seemingly minor details, like a parking ticket issued near a crime scene, can provide the crucial break in a major case, and how thorough follow-up on every lead, no matter how insignificant it might appear, can make the difference between a case that remains unsolved and one that results in arrest and conviction. For the victims of the Son of Sam shootings and their families, the arrest and conviction of David Berkowitz provided some closure and the knowledge that the person who had destroyed their lives or killed their loved ones would never walk free again, though no sentence could truly compensate for the permanent disabilities suffered by survivors like Robert Violante, who lost his sight, or the loss experienced by families like the Moskowitz family, whose daughter Stacy died for no reason other than being in the wrong place when a disturbed man decided to kill. The streets of New York City, which had been gripped by fear during the summer of 1977, when the Son of Sam was still at large and young couples were afraid to go on dates or park in isolated areas, returned to their normal rhythm after Berkowitz's arrest, though the memory of that terror and the randomness of his violence left a permanent mark on the city's collective psyche and contributed to the perception of New York in the 1970s as a dangerous, crime-ridden urban jungle. The fact that most of Berkowitz's attacks occurred in the late evening or early morning hours but took place on public streets, in residential neighborhoods, and in areas where people lived their normal lives, demonstrated that serial killers don't only operate in darkness and isolation but can strike in populated areas during times when witnesses might be present, and that the element of surprise combined with quick execution can allow even brazen attacks in public spaces to succeed. The parking ticket that ultimately led to David Berkowitz's capture has become one of the most famous pieces of evidence in criminal justice history. A perfect example of how even the smallest detail can unravel a criminal's carefully constructed anonymity, and how thorough police work that follows every lead, checks every database, and pursues every possible connection can eventually identify even the most elusive perpetrators. Detective James Justice, whose diligent follow-up on the parking ticket lead broke the Son of Sam case, received well-deserved recognition for his work, though he characteristically deflected credit to the entire investigative team and noted that solving major cases almost always requires contributions from many officers and investigators rather than the work of a single detective hero. David Berkowitz remains incarcerated in New York State Prison, where he has been denied parole multiple times and will almost certainly spend the rest of his life. And while he has given various interviews over the decades and has made different statements about his motivations and mental state at the time of the killings, the fundamental truth remains that he chose to murder innocent people, terrorized an entire city, and destroyed multiple families for reasons that, whether attributed to demons or to his own psychological pathology, can never justify or explain the suffering he caused. The Son of Sam case stands as a reminder that serial killers can be caught through patient, methodical police work that pays attention to details, that sometimes the break in a case comes from an unexpected source like a parking ticket rather than dramatic detective work, and that even in a city of millions of people where anonymity seems assured, careful investigation can eventually identify and apprehend even the most careful criminals who think they have committed the perfect crime and gotten away with murder, though in David Berkowitz's case, his capture came only after he had already claimed 6 lives and wounded 7 other people in attacks that occurred on city streets during evening and early morning hours when New York was supposedly awake and alert, proving once again that determined criminals can commit shocking violence in public spaces if they are willing to strike quickly and then blend back into the urban landscape before authorities can respond. Number 10. The shooting of George Wallace, a presidential candidate paralyzed at a campaign rally on May 15, 1972, Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was running for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination and drawing large crowds with his populist, segregationist message that appealed to working-class white voters who felt alienated by both major political parties, arrived at the Laurel Shopping Center in Laurel, Maryland, to hold a campaign rally in the parking lot. A typical venue for Wallace's campaign, which preferred outdoor events where large numbers of supporters could gather without the expense and logistical challenges of indoor facilities. Wallace, who was 52 years old and running his 3rd campaign for president after previous attempts in 1964 and 1968, had been drawing significant support in the Democratic primaries and was emerging as a major factor in the 1972 race, winning primaries in several states and demonstrating that his controversial views on race, federal power, and law and order resonated with a substantial portion of the American electorate, much to the concern of Democratic Party leaders who viewed him as a dangerous demagogue whose success was splitting the party and potentially ensuring President Richard Nixon's re-election. The rally at the Laurel Shopping Center drew approximately 1,000 people, a solid crowd for a primary campaign event, and Wallace delivered his standard stump speech attacking federal bureaucrats, defending states' rights, criticizing forced busing for school integration, and promising to stand up for the forgotten working people against elites who looked down on them, rhetoric that generated enthusiastic applause from his supporters who saw him as a voice for their frustrations and fears. At approximately 4 p.m., after finishing his speech from a small stage in the parking lot, Wallace descended into the crowd to shake hands and greet supporters, a practice he enjoyed and that was typical for politicians of that era when security was much less stringent than it would later become and candidates were expected to physically interact with voters rather than remaining isolated behind barriers and security cordons. As Wallace moved through the crowd, shaking hands, signing autographs, and chatting with supporters, Arthur Bremer, a 21-year-old busboy from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had been following Wallace's campaign for weeks looking for an opportunity to assassinate the candidate, moved close to Wallace and suddenly pulled out a .38 caliber Charter Arms revolver and began firing at point-blank range, getting off 5 shots in rapid succession before being tackled and disarmed by Wallace's security personnel and members of the crowd. The first bullet struck Wallace in the abdomen and continued through his body, lodging near his spine and causing catastrophic damage to his spinal cord that would leave him permanently paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Additional bullets struck 3 other people in the crowd. Secret Service agent Nick Zarvos was shot in the throat, Alabama State Trooper Captain E.C. Dothard was shot in the stomach, and campaign volunteer Dora Thompson was shot in the leg, with all 3 victims suffering serious but not life-threatening injuries. Wallace collapsed to the ground as chaos erupted in the parking lot, with screaming, panicking crowd members running in all directions, security personnel struggling to secure the scene and get the wounded to medical care, and Arthur Bremer being subdued and arrested while Wallace lay bleeding on the pavement, conscious but in severe pain and going into shock from his injuries. Wallace was rushed to Holy Cross Hospital in nearby Silver Spring, Maryland, where trauma surgeons worked to stabilize his condition and began the process of assessing and treating his multiple gunshot wounds, quickly determining that the bullet lodged near his spine had caused severe damage that would likely result in permanent paralysis. News that was devastating not just for Wallace personally, but for his campaign, which effectively ended at that moment even though he technically remained a candidate. The assassination attempt on George Wallace dominated news coverage for days, with television networks providing continuous updates on his condition, political analysts discussing the implications for the 1972 campaign, and law enforcement officials investigating Arthur Bremer's background and motives to determine whether he had acted alone or as part of a conspiracy. The investigation revealed that Bremer was a deeply disturbed and isolated individual who had been planning to assassinate some prominent political figure for months, having initially stalked President Nixon and attended Nixon campaign events looking for an opportunity to shoot the president. But when he found Nixon's security too tight to penetrate, he switched his focus to George Wallace, whose more accessible campaign style and smaller security detail provided a better opportunity for an assassination attempt. Bremer had kept a detailed diary documenting his thoughts, plans, and movements as he stalked first Nixon and then Wallace, and this diary, which was recovered from his apartment after his arrest, provided investigators with a disturbing window into the mind of a would-be assassin who was motivated not by political ideology but by a desire for fame and notoriety, viewing assassination as a way to escape his meaningless existence and achieve the recognition he craved, similar to other assassins, and would-be assassins who sought to make their mark on history through violence against prominent figures. The diary entries showed that Bremer didn't particularly care about Wallace's politics or positions and had only targeted him because he was famous and accessible. A chilling revelation that underscored how random and senseless political violence often is, with the victims chosen not because of what they represent or believe, but simply because they are prominent enough to generate media attention when attacked. Arthur Bremer was charged with multiple counts including attempted murder, assault with intent to commit murder, and federal charges related to attacking a presidential candidate, and his trial, which took place in August 1972, attracted significant media attention, though far less than the assassination attempt itself had generated. Bremer's defense attorneys attempted to argue that he was legally insane and could not be held responsible for his actions, but psychiatric experts who examined him found that while he had significant psychological problems and personality disorders, he understood the nature and consequences of his actions and was legally sane under Maryland law, clearing the way for prosecution. On August 4, 1972, after a trial that lasted less than 2 weeks, the jury convicted Arthur Bremer on all counts, and he was sentenced to 63 years in prison, later reduced to 53 years on appeal, ensuring that he would spend most of his adult life behind bars for his attempt to murder George Wallace and the injuries he inflicted on 3 other people. George Wallace survived his injuries but never walked again, spending the remaining 26 years of his life in a wheelchair and dealing with constant pain from his spinal injury, complications including infections and other medical problems, and the psychological impact of having his political career and personal mobility stolen by a disturbed young man with a gun. Wallace attempted to continue his political career from his wheelchair, even running for president again in 1976, though his campaign was hampered by his physical limitations and by changing political dynamics that had made his segregationist message less viable than it had been in the early 1970s, and he eventually returned to Alabama where he served additional terms as governor and, in his later years, renounced his earlier segregationist positions and sought forgiveness from Black Alabamians for the harm his rhetoric and policies had caused, a transformation that some viewed as genuine redemption while others saw as politically motivated or insufficient given the damage he had done during his segregationist years. The shooting of George Wallace had significant implications for American politics and campaign security, leading to increased Secret Service protection for presidential candidates even during primary campaigns, more restrictive crowd control measures at political events, and a general acknowledgement that the relatively open and accessible style of campaigning that had been traditional in American politics was no longer safe in an era when disturbed individuals with guns could strike at any time. The Laurel Shopping Center parking lot where Wallace was shot has changed over the decades, with the shopping center itself being redeveloped and modernized, but the location remains historically significant as the site where a major presidential candidate was nearly killed and where the trajectory of the 1972 campaign was fundamentally altered, as Wallace's removal from the race likely affected the outcome of several primaries and may have influenced the eventual nomination of George McGovern, who went on to lose to Richard Nixon in one of the most lopsided presidential elections in American history. For Arthur Bremer, who served 35 years in prison before being released on parole in 2007, the assassination attempt that he believed would make him famous and important instead resulted in decades of imprisonment, with his name becoming a footnote in political history rather than the household word he had imagined, and his diary, which he had hoped would be published and read as the manifesto of a significant historical figure, was mainly studied by psychologists and law enforcement officials, trying to understand the mindset of political assassins rather than being celebrated as literature or political philosophy. The victims who survived the shooting, including Secret Service agent Nick Zarvos, Captain E.C. Dothard, and Dora Thompson, all recovered from their physical injuries, though they carried the psychological scars of surviving an assassination attempt and being shot simply because they were in proximity to George Wallace when Arthur Bremer decided to make his violent bid for notoriety. George Wallace died in 1998 at the age of 79, having lived more than a quarter century after the shooting that paralyzed him, and while his legacy remains controversial due to his segregationist politics and the harm his rhetoric caused during the civil rights era, his personal story of surviving an assassination attempt, living with severe disability, and eventually seeking reconciliation with those he had wronged adds complexity to a figure who might otherwise be remembered simply as a villain of American political history. The shooting occurred in broad daylight in a shopping center parking lot, in front of approximately 1,000 people, including numerous journalists and photographers who captured the immediate aftermath on film, making it one of the most publicly witnessed assassination attempts in American history and demonstrating once again that political violence can erupt anywhere, even in mundane suburban settings during ordinary campaign events when candidates are simply trying to connect with voters and exercise the democratic tradition of retail politics that had been a cornerstone of American campaigns for generations. The fact that Arthur Bremer was able to get so close to Wallace despite the presence of Secret Service agents and other security personnel highlighted the limitations of protective measures when candidates insist on maintaining direct physical contact with crowds, a tension that continues to exist in American politics between the democratic ideal of accessible leaders who mingle with citizens and the security reality that such accessibility creates opportunities for violence that can be exploited by anyone with a weapon and the willingness to use it. Today, when presidential candidates campaign behind barriers, with extensive security screening for all attendees, and with Secret Service agents maintaining protective formations that limit direct contact with crowds, the shooting of George Wallace is often cited as the event that marked the end of the era of truly open, accessible political campaigning in America, though candidates still attempt to maintain some level of personal connection with voters even as security concerns require careful choreography and controlled environments that would have been unthinkable to politicians of earlier generations. The parking lot shooting that paralyzed George Wallace and wounded 3 other people in the middle of a sunny afternoon at a Maryland shopping center stands as a stark reminder that in American politics, where democratic traditions emphasize accessibility and where firearms are widely available to both stable citizens and disturbed individuals alike, the line between a successful campaign rally and a tragedy is often nothing more than the luck of trajectory, the speed of security response, and the random factors that determine whether a bullet strikes a vital organ or misses by inches, creating outcomes that can change the course of history or simply add another name to the long list of political violence that has scarred American democracy from its earliest days to the present moment.